Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Lunch in Pompeii, a speaker series brought to you by the College of Sciences at the University of Central Florida and in partnership with the Orlando Science Center. My name is Brandon Landman. I'm the Vice President of Visitor Experience for the Orlando Science Center, and I'm very excited to present to you Pompeii, the Immortal City. Every 5 years or so, the Science Center brings in a blockbuster exhibit to bring to our community and to have exciting opportunities to learn about cultures, science, technologies from around the world. Pompeii is the perfect experience for these times. Timed entry creates limited capacity for our exhibit experience. On top of that, we also have ample space in our 10,000 square foot exhibit hall for you to wander and explore all the amazing artifacts that you're going to find. We chose Pompeii, the Immortal City because of the amazing stories that it has, and its connection to today is just more relevant than you would ever know. The science, the technology, the engineering, the mathematics, the STEM content that takes place in Rome and Italy 2,000 years ago is so relevant to today, from urban planning to plumbing, to glassworking, to metalworking, to measurements. It's all there. And we get to learn from that experience and explore that experience in detail that you've never seen before. Pompeii, the Immortal City is funded in part by Orange County government through the Arts and Cultural Affairs Blockbuster program and its tourism partners. Thanks to their support, we were able to bring this once-in-a-lifetime experience to our community, and we're able to offer free admission to our members. Pompeii will be with us until January 24th, 2021. We're the final stop in the United States. You won't be able to see this at any other time. Unless you go to Italy. So stop in, get your tickets, enjoy the experience, and come explore the amazing Pompeii, the Immortal City. Thank you for your support and enjoy today's presentation.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our third Lunch in Pompeii, presented by UCF College of Sciences and Orlando Science Center. My name is Jesse Zito. I'm the Director of Programs at Orlando Science Center. We're excited to offer this opportunity again, and I'm happy to see the incredible response we've gotten for this speaker series. On October 26th, Orlando Science Center officially opened Pompeii, the Immortal City. I'd encourage everyone to visit Orlando Science Center for your chance to see these incredible artifacts up close before it closes on January 24th. A few notes about today's presentation. Today's presentation will be followed by a Q&A session, so stick around to the end. The questions have been excellent in the previous speaker series that we've done. You're welcome to submit questions during the presentation using the Q&A feature on your screen. And we would like to let everyone know that today's presentation will include images of human remains. Today we have a fascinating presentation from Dr. Sandra Wheeler. Dr. Wheeler is an associate lecturer specializing in bioarchaeology. She received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Western Ontario in 2009. Her current research focuses on the bioarchaeological analysis of infants and children to shed light on mortuary practices involving the youngest members of society. This research synthesizes information from the social, cultural, and natural environments to gain an understanding of children's lives and deaths. In the past, and Dr. Wheeler also researches ancient birthing practices, maternal health, growth and development, ancient health and disease, and mortuary landscapes. Her current and upcoming fieldwork examines patterns of health and disease, trauma, and mortuary practices in ancient Egyptian populations. I want to welcome Dr. Sandra Wheeler to the talk. I'm very excited that she's here to share her expertise with us. This is going to be absolutely fascinating, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Wheeler as soon as you're ready.
Thank you so much. That was a really warm welcome. I really appreciate that. So I am ready to share my screen.
Wonderful. I'm going to step out and I'll leave it up to you.
Okay. All right, hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today. I'd also like to thank the College of Sciences at UCF for inviting me to speak about the bodies of Pompeii. So in today's lecture, I focus on the human remains left behind by the events surrounding the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79, basically looking at the people of Pompeii themselves. And then I'll talk a bit about how we know what we know about their lives and deaths through the scientific analysis of their bodies, their bones, and their teeth. So as Jesse said, I'll be showing images of the casts themselves, as well as some human skeletal remains in this lecture. Now, as a bioarchaeologist or someone who studies ancient human remains, this is incredibly exciting because we're often used to working in ancient cemeteries or necropoli, basically in more formal spaces where the dead have been intentionally placed by the living. Pompeii and the surrounding areas provide scientists with something completely different. People literally caught in time, fleeing for their lives in the midst of a disaster event. Now, much of what's known about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius comes from accounts of observers and also people who escaped. It's thought that almost 20,000 people were able to flee, so they're fairly good written accounts of the events of the day and the days that followed. Pliny the Younger recounted his uncle's story of the eruption from outside of Pompeii. You can see a brief quote on the screen. Now, during the first phase of the eruption, pumice and ash covered the city from the first eruptive column. And it's thought that most Pompeiians survived this first phase, and it's likely when they escaped. People that stayed likely died from collapsing roofs and walls from the accumulation of pumice and ash. Now, the day after the eruption, the cone of the volcano exploded or collapsed, and this triggered a massive 100-mile-an-hour pyroclastic flow, covering everything in its path. Of course, not only Pompeii itself was covered, but the landscape and surrounding villages and towns as well. Now, this second pyroclastic flow was the most violent and the most energetic, causing the most amount of damage and death, and ultimately burying the city. Now, Pompeii and the surrounding towns like Herculaneum pretty much remained buried until the 18th century when they were discovered by accident during the construction of a palace. Now, when we think about Pompeii, this is usually what we imagine. The people and animals caught just going about their day. And these Pompeiians are really unique in how they were created. When hot ash covered the bodies of people and animals, and of course all the stuff in Pompeii, they became trapped. And then subsequent rains compacted the ash and hardened it, so it was almost like concrete. The bodies went through their normal decomposition processes, eventually leaving only the skeletal remains behind. But because the ash was very compact, it kept the shape of whatever it covered. So the bones remained inside, but those voids where the soft tissue and their clothing were stayed. When formal excavations began in the late 1800s, these voids were found to contain human and animal bones. So in 1860, the then director of excavations at Pompeii, Giuseppe Fiorelli, developed a way to create plaster casts out of the voids. They filled those voids with plaster, then excavated the surrounding ash to reveal the original body form and position. So in total, there's about 100 or so casts that were made. They're all kind of in variable states of preservation and conservation. Many of them were damaged during the bombings in World War II, and others have just become damaged over time. There've been a few other casts that have been made in the 20th century, and I'll show you a few more recent ones that have been created. But I love this dog here on the left of your screen because you can see his collar that's still attached. Now, most of the people that have been excavated from Pompeii are fully skeletonized. Many of these have been studied by bioarchaeologists and other biological anthropologists. And these studies have provided great insight into the life and health and ultimately the death of the ancient Pompeiians. So bioarchaeologists, like forensic anthropologists, use skeletal indicators from bone and teeth to determine an individual's age at death. For adults, we use it to determine their biological sex and their stature or their living height in order to provide information on their health, whether they suffered from particular diseases or they experienced skeletal trauma like fractures, for example. and whether those fractures healed or occurred around the time of death. Now on the screen, you can see a picture of Dr. Estelle Laser. She's from the University of Sydney, and she's one of the researchers who has analyzed the human skeletal remains from Pompeii. And she's also director of the Pompeii Cast Project, which is a project whose aim is to CT scan all of the plaster casts. And if you're interested, she has a really great audio lecture on SoundCloud where she talks about the process of CT scanning and the multidisciplinary team that she worked with to get this all done. Now it's estimated that the population of Pompeii was between maybe 10 to 20,000 people at the time of the eruption. And to date, about 1,200 individuals or so have been excavated from the site. So the majority of what we know about the Pompeiians themselves through the analyses of their bodies comes from their skeletal remains. Unfortunately, most of the skeletons that were excavated prior to the diligent, more detail-oriented and scientific work that archaeologists do today, so many of the bones were placed in very large storerooms without regard to keeping individuals together. So here you can see Dr. Laser. She is in the midst of a giant pile of bones. Many of them are broken. It's difficult to determine which people sort of go together. And then on the other side of her body, you can see sort of broken pieces of plaster casts. So not all of the casts that were made of the that people worked. So some of them broke, and over time, some pieces broke off. And as pieces broke off, they were just placed in these large storerooms. So you can get an idea of the condition of some of those skeletal remains. So even though the skeletal assemblage from Pompeii is all jumbled up, there are some things that we can say. So we know that the skeletons represent a cross-section of the population. So infants, children, middle-aged adults, and old people are all there. Because it was a disaster, it ended up being a random sample of a normally distributed population. And this is different than what you might expect in a cemetery population, for example, where people are dying sort of their natural deaths when it's time. Many of the victims of Pompeii suffered severe head injuries, so there's a lot of skull fractures, perhaps caused by falling rock or rubble as their houses collapsed on them. There were also many earthquakes that followed the eruption, so a lot of buildings collapsed at that time too. And of course, others likely suffocated from the toxic fumes and hot ash, as is evidenced by some of the body positions of the individuals that were found. Based on measurements of the thigh bone or the femur, adult Pompeiians were about as tall as their other Roman counterparts, so they weren't taller or any shorter, they were about the same. There's evidence that people experienced pretty severe childhood illnesses, but then survived them into adulthood and old age. There's also skeletal evidence of tuberculosis, brucellosis, and also osteoarthritis. This is pretty common in ancient populations. They had a moderate amount of dental health, moderate dental health. People had cavities, they had tooth loss, they had plaque buildup on their teeth as well. And there's some evidence of tooth extraction. Overall, there was a low frequency of trauma, so there is evidence of healed fractures, suggesting medical care or bone setting was happening. And then, of course, those fractures that likely occurred around the time of death, excuse me. So, of course, there are lots of conditions that don't affect the skeleton, but from those that do, the findings are pretty consistent with other populations in Italy at the time. Now, excavations from the late 1800s are pretty different from those undertaken today. So here's an example of an Italian biological anthropologist carefully excavating the remains of a young child from Pompeii. And these remains eventually undergo a bioarchaeological analysis. So I wanted to start off with some of the more recent finds from Pompeii, as these have been in the news recently. So during excavations a few years ago at a site called Civita Guiliana, this is a large suburban villa just northwest of Pompeii. Italian archaeologists discovered these horse and people-shaped voids, and they proceeded using modern technology like what you see here. So the gentleman on the right is using an endoscope, which is basically a tiny mounted camera that can squeeze into tight spaces. Bone samples were also taken for analysis, and then they decided to create plaster casts of these individuals. So on the other picture on the other side, you can see the biological anthropologist. She's kind of looking at this hole, and within that hole is our human remains. So they also 3D laser scanned the area, and you can see the laser scan that's mounted on the bottom of that tripod. And then the careful pouring of the plaster, letting it cure, and then excavating the surrounding ash, just like they did in the 1800s. And this is the image that was in the New York Times just a few months ago. These are the two bodies that were cast and excavated, and they were found in a covered walkway in the main part of the villa. Skeletal analysis suggests the younger man was about 5'1", and between the ages of about 18 and 25. Because the condition of his vertebrae and his young age, his vertebrae were in pretty rough shape, suggesting a life of heavy labor, archaeologists suggested he was likely a slave, and evidence of his clothing was pretty consistent with this idea. And slavery, we know, was widely practiced throughout the Roman Empire. Now, the older man was a little bit taller, about 5'4" and a little bit older, between 30 and 40 years, and he wore a tunic and a woolen mantle. And this clothing was a lot more intricate than the other, further suggesting an unequal social status between the two men. Near the victims were other voids which held objects, and their shapes indicated that they were likely bundles of cloth, perhaps carried by these two men as they tried to flee towards the stables, but ultimately got caught up in the eruption. Now, a few years earlier, in the same villa, archaeologists found the stables, and they made a plaster cast of one of the harnessed horses. And you can see a little bit of the disturbance to the horse on the leg portions due to past looting activity. They didn't cast some of the other horses. They excavated the skeletal remains to get information on horse domestication during this period of time in Italy. Now, the other story that made the news this year was in January, and this isn't from Pompeii, but it's from Herculaneum. And it's thought that the pyroclastic flow was a lot hotter at that city because Herculaneum is located right at the foothill of Mount Vesuvius. And researchers thought that when this individual was enveloped in a hot surge of ash, the victim's brain just became superheated and burned to twisted black bits through a process called vitrification. So when something vitrifies, it turns hard and glassy. So all the press reported on glass brains from Herculaneum. And I had a bunch of students send this story to me because they're like, look, this is so cool. But I think that these two recent publications show that Pompeii and the surrounding areas still capture the public's attention. And just to kind of describe what's on the screen for you, this is one piece of this vitrified brain material, and it's showing two different views of it. Now, the current archaeological superintendency has been undertaking a massive project to move, conserve, and restore the original casts that were made using both traditional techniques as well as modern techniques like 3D scanning to ensure that they survive long into the future. Now, 3D scans are super cool and really awesome because they provide a digital record, a permanent digital record of the casts. But they're also a really important teaching tool because the scans can be shared with museums, they can be shared with schools, and the coolest thing is that you can then 3D print any one of these casts to scale. So here you can see images of the Italian conservators working to repair and stabilize the different casts. And here is one of the more iconic images of an adult, presumably a parent and a child, in the process of being conserved. And you can see the workroom in the background of the picture as well. Conservation and stabilization occurred, but also X-ray, CT, and digital scanning were part of this large project. And CT is really great because it allows researchers to scan through the plaster to visualize the skeletal remains inside. So on the screen at the top, you can see a 4-year-old boy that was found with his family. And on the bottom, you can see a series of photographs. One of them shows one of the Italian archaeologists gently holding the child, preparing him for CT scanning. And then the next 2 images, you can see the 3D surface scan from the CT, and then the internal scan showing the bones and teeth of the child that are still preserved. What's really interesting about this little boy too is you can still see his clothing. Now on the screen, you can see a close-up of an individual's skull with the plaster that's still covering part of the face. In the middle image, you can see a 3D rendering of another skull from the CT scans. And because these are 3D scans, you can peel away the plaster and get a good look at the bones and teeth without disturbing any more of the remains. And on the far side here, you can see outlines of the plaster kind of in a grayish color. And then the bones are artificially colored to make it easier to analyze and take measurements. Now I'll wrap up here showing you a few more images of these plaster casts. The Garden of the Fugitives holds the largest number of victims that were found in one place. In this particular area, there are 13 victims here. They're adults and children, and they likely died while trying to find a way out through one of the city gates and then became trapped there. And I'll say that there are individuals that are scattered throughout the city of Pompeii. Some of them are inside buildings, some of them are in hallways or porticos. It just depends on sort of where they were caught in that moment. There are a few individuals found in the Villa of the Mysteries. Here you can see one of the museum displays where they are placing the individuals where they were found within the buildings. There were a few people that were also still found in the Stabian thermal baths. These are heated Roman bathhouses. And again, you can see some of the museum, the site museum displays and how individuals are where they were found. And this is an image from a few years ago of one of the open air museums on the site. So you can see all of the objects, the pottery, and then you have one of the casts that are there as well. In recent years, they've built a brand new visitor center at the site with many more displays of the plaster casts and some pretty innovative ways of showing showcasing not only the plaster cast, but also the artifacts that have been recovered from the city of Pompeii. And I'll finish here with the 2 individuals that are featured in the Pompeii exhibit at the Orlando Science Center. I am super excited to see the exhibit. I have tickets for next week. I definitely encourage all of you to visit the Orlando Science Center if you can. I'm super excited about it. So I am very glad to have been able to share this incredibly brief glimpse into the lives and deaths of the ancient Pompeiians. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Wheeler. That was an incredible presentation, very interesting. So many things that I did not know anything about in that. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us and share your expertise and your experience. We'll be back in just a minute with the Q&A session after we hear from Tasha Dupre, Interim Dean at UCF's College of Sciences and an Orlando Science Center board member. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Tasha Dupre, the Interim Dean of the College of Sciences at the University of Central Florida. We would like to thank you for virtually attending our Lunch in Pompeii speaker series hosted by the UCF College of Sciences and the Orlando Science Center. We are excited to partner once again with the Orlando Science Center to bring you some very interesting and informative talks given by faculty from our college and educators from the Orlando Science Center. We would like to invite you to join us for the remainder of the talks in this Lunch in Pompeii speaker series. The talks occur once a month through January. Information on the series and the RSVP links for each talk can be found at sciences.ucf.edu/lunch-in-Pompeii. The website link will appear on the closing slide that you will see next. We would like to encourage you to come to the Orlando Science Center and visit this amazing exhibit firsthand. The exhibit will be on display during the Orlando Science Center's normal business hours from October 26th through January 24th. Now please stay online for the question and answer session with our speaker.
All right, everybody. We're back with a chance for you to have your questions answered by Dr. Wheeler. I'm going to start with a few myself, and we'll take questions from the audience. You can submit your questions to the chat using the Q&A section below, and you can also upvote questions if you see one on there that you really want to have answered. We're going to start off, Dr. Wheeler, with two questions that I've been asking our speakers. They've been very interesting answers, and I think it really gets to the heart of what we do at the Orlando Science Center, and then, of course, what you do in the academic world at UCF. So I want to start off by talking to you about informal education. Education that happens outside of a classroom. It can happen in so many different ways, but we know that informal education a lot of times can spark a lot of interest and a lot of joy about a certain topic. So my question to you is, museums and informal education centers like the Orlando Science Center are dedicated to inspiring lifelong learning and sparking early interest. Have you had any impactful informal education experiences that you feel have set you on your path?
That's a really great question, and I'm glad you asked that, because for me, I can't stress enough the importance of public television while I was growing up. I can definitely say that I grew up on PBS. It was something that I watched a lot with my family, especially my mom. It really shaped how I saw the world and how I thought about what I wanted to be when I grew up. I watched a lot of nature shows. I watched a lot of history shows. I watched a lot of documentaries. And I think those really early experiences with public television really influenced me to be interested in the arts and history and culture and science. So I think it's an incredible resource for the American public. It's free and it's accessible to everybody. So I think supporting programs like PBS, and I'm going to plug NPR, are really important for these kind of informal educational experiences.
Yeah, experiences that are, for the most part, accessible to everyone. And I really remember as a child watching a show called Wild America all the time.
I loved Wild America. I loved it.
Yeah, I would get so excited about the animals. And now as an adult, wherever I go, when I see animals, I get overly excited, and everyone with me kind of makes fun of me for how excited I get. But it really gave me a big appreciation for nature and animals. What a wonderful answer.
Yeah.
My second question for you here is basically, what advice do you have for anyone who might be interested in studying social sciences or a STEM field in college?
I think it's really, really important to stress the idea of a multidisciplinary education and multidisciplinary work. So in all of the slides that I showed you when I talked about all of the different analyses that are undertaken, those are all undertaken by multidisciplinary teams. So researchers working with a group of specialists in order to address particular questions. I don't think I've ever been part of an archaeological project that isn't multidisciplinary. So everyone brings their specializations and their particular research questions into that group. And so, even if you're heavily focused on one specific field in STEM or even in the social sciences, it's important to also understand that a lot of this work is done in multidisciplinary teams, and it makes the research, I think, richer and the interpretations richer.
Yeah, definitely. I want to turn to some of the questions that are coming in, because now we're starting to see a lot of them here, and they're looking really good. I'm going to start off with, let me take a look here. First one that we have. So very interesting question. We actually hear this all the time in the exhibit from our guests that are visiting. How much of the city of Pompeii still remains unearthed or unstudied?
So it's my understanding that about a third of the surrounding area still has yet to be excavated. Likely a lot of it is probably underneath the modern towns and the modern structures. Formal excavations really began in the 1860s. They are still continuing today because there are still excavations going on today. So the majority of Pompeii has been excavated. The surrounding areas are probably just underneath modern buildings and modern towns. But it's exciting because it also means that there's more to be discovered.
Yeah, and then a question I think that may have come from some of the images in your talk. So question here is, are the workspaces actually ancient buildings on site with modern roofing? There was I think that this may have come from some of the pictures of the storage of the artifacts and maybe where they were working on them.
Yeah, so the archaeological program at Pompeii requires that the work be done on site. And so there are some ancient buildings that were, of course, they've been stabilized for safety and covered over to keep the weather out. But a lot of that conservation work had to be done on site. They did not allow the cast to be removed because of their delicate nature. And so if you listen to Dr. Laser's audio lecture on SoundCloud, she talks about they had to bring a CT machine to the site. So they couldn't bring those individuals to a hospital to get CT scan. They actually brought a CT machine to the site itself in order to be able to CT scan. Wow. So yeah, how cool is that you get to work in an ancient building on this material right in the place where it all happened.
Yeah, that is amazing. There's a question here about the CT scans. Have the CT scans showed anything surprising medically speaking?
I think to my knowledge, they've sort of confirmed what we have, what researchers have found with their skeletal analyses. I think that there was a publication or news stories a few years back that they're like, oh, the Pompeiians had great dental health. Actually was probably about the same as what were found in the skeletal remains. They also found more evidence of skull fractures in the CT scan, suggesting that people died from falling rock or collapsing walls rather than some of the toxic fumes.
Yeah. Okay, so actually you just answered one of our next questions. It was about the dental health of Pompeiians. So you're saying it's, for the most part, it's similar to what would have been happening in the surrounding areas. You talked about tooth extraction. Do we have evidence that there was any sort of like dentistry going on? Or are we talking about there was a bad tooth and it just needed to be taken out?
I think it's probably the latter. There's not really great evidence for dentistry as a profession. At the time, there has been sort of a cache of extracted teeth that have been found at Pompeii, suggesting someone is pulling teeth in this place consistently or chucking teeth that have been extracted. But this is pretty common around the world when you don't have access to a dentist and you have a tooth abscess and your tooth really hurts. Someone has knowledge to get that tooth out.
Yeah, boy, that sounds like a rough experience.
Yeah.
Can you just speak to like the overall health of most Pompeians? Were they reasonably healthy?
Yeah, we think that they were reasonably healthy in for an ancient population, pretty much what we would expect pre pre-medicinal times or pre-modern medicine times where people had access to antibiotics. So I mentioned that the master and the slave were about 5'4" and 5'1". That was pretty standard for many populations around the time. And we use adult height or adult stature as a measure of health. So if people are unusually short, it might mean that they're suffering from a lot of childhood illnesses that might affect their growth potential as adults. If they're a little bit taller, it suggests that they're kind of buffered a little bit from some of those stresses, maybe because they're wealthier, they have greater access to resources. This could be why the master in that particular case was just a bit taller than the other individual. Maybe he had better access to better quality food. But in terms of their overall health, it's pretty much what we would expect of other Roman populations at the time. We know that there was a variety of foods that were available, but the foods that people had access to were limited based on your social class. We know that Roman society, and Pompeii in particular, was very socially stratified. So there were very wealthy people and very poor people, and then people in between. And then there were also slaves. Some of the individuals that were cast were found with iron shackles on their ankles. So we know that there was lots of social inequality at the time, and based on your social status is what you had access to.
Yeah, and you. So I just want to make sure I understand, because we get this question a lot. We have a bathtub, a ancient Roman bathtub that's in the exhibit, and it seems small. And so the first question from guests is, how tall were these people, right? So we're saying like a 5'4" might be about the average height for someone?
For a man. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, excellent.
Sure.
Let me take a look here. Let's see. Is the black material in the brain flaky, or was it hard to pull apart to even show a piece?
So I read the article. It came out in the New England Journal of Medicine, I think, and it was this is gory, but they think that the skull got superheated and exploded from the hot ash and the hot volcanic fumes, and it was this intense heat that caused the brain to essentially vitrify. So it is hard, brittle, and shiny, and it was found encrusted inside a skull. This was the skeleton, I think, was originally excavated in the 1980s, but it's not unusual for scientists to go back and reanalyze using new methods. And so the image that I showed on the screen was part of that incrustation that was found inside a skull. Yeah,
it has the look and the way you're describing it makes me think of like obsidian, like
exactly. Yeah. It would kind of look like that, and that's where the vitrification comes, like that glass-like quality.
Yeah.
But of course, it was very sensational, right? The glass brains from Herculaneum. But I think it goes to show that even new finds from Pompeii really capture the public's attention.
Yeah, it really highlights the heat that we're talking about here. I mean,
so in the paper they mentioned they believe temperatures were at Herculaneum were about 400 degrees Celsius.
Wow, holy smokes.
Yeah.
All right, let's see here. Is there any way that the room that was full of bone fragments could be sorted by way of DNA to put entire people back together?
If you have probably like $4 million, yes. So there has been DNA work done on some of the skeletal material from Pompeii. It is not to put individuals together, but rather to test for the preservation of DNA, and they have been able to extract DNA from the preserved remains. And this is basically to test, we know that these skeletal remains have experienced intense heat is there still DNA, viable DNA? And there is. If you were to say in that room full of bones, DNA test every single bit of bone, it would cost so much money. It would take so much time. And then you basically destroy the sample. You destroy the bones by extracting the DNA. And so conceivably you could, I think the practice now, and particularly in the 20th century in archaeology, is to just be more diligent, be more careful. And then, I think also in the 1800s, there wasn't this idea that you could get much information from studying the skeleton. And so we know now how much information we can get from analyzing not just bone, but individuals, so individual people. And so, of course, people are much more meticulous now when they excavate, and they keep individuals together, and are much more careful about how they handle the human remains.
Yeah, I mean, it's the scientific process is always amazing to me. The more detailed it is, the more careful you are with what you're doing. Obviously, the more information you're going to get out of everything that you're doing.
Documentation, documentation, documentation. Because once you excavate an archaeological site, you're essentially destroying it. And so you destroy it by excavating it. And so documentation is incredibly, incredibly important. And Giovanni Fiorelli never documented how he created these casts. He just did it. So we don't have a really great idea about the process that he went through. And there are casts that, he did a poor job of pouring the plaster. The plaster was too runny, or it was too thick. Pieces broke off of the, people. So you could see Dr. Laser, she's got some arms, plastered arms right next to her. And then finally he got the recipe right, made about 100 and then stopped.
It makes me think of something the Mythbusters used to say, which is the difference between science and screwing around is writing it down. And just making sure everything is documented properly is pretty important with this.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, let's see here. How much imaging is possible without digging up the remains?
So leaving them in the ground without excavating them entirely. So you can use a process called GPR, which is ground penetrating radar. It has pretty good resolution for things like buildings, maybe for larger objects. GPR would be really good for letting you know, hey, there is a shape under here about 1 meter deep that looks like it's person sized, but you wouldn't get any finer resolution than that. And so I look forward to the day, like in Star Trek, when they use tricorders and can just scan everything. Unfortunately, the technology isn't quite there yet. So with GPR, it's a really great tool. But in terms of the resolution of smaller objects that it gives you, is just the technology is not there yet. So excavation would have to be the way that you would find out.
This is always one of those things that it comes up at the museum a lot. So,
it's called ground truthing. So you find something either on satellite imagery or through GPR, and how you confirm it is you excavate it.
Yeah. I think sometimes it can be difficult because if we watch a movie like Jurassic Park, which was 1994, there's a scene in that where one simple flip of a switch and they have a scanned velociraptor under the ground and they know every bone where it is and it's perfect looking.
I can't wait for that technology.
Right. We're definitely not there. All right. This is a really interesting question. I feel like one of the things about your talk is it really puts into perspective the people and the tragedy of the eruption. And the question here, let's see, has anyone been able to identify by name any of the bodies? Could we put a name or a face on those?
Not to my knowledge. I could be mistaken about that. I am not aware of any known individuals that have been identified. I think in cases of disaster, natural disaster or man-made disaster, people end up in places where they don't belong, right? They exit their house, they run into other buildings. And so even if you were able to identify, like Civita Guiliana, this is this person's house because we have records that they own this house, you wouldn't really know if the people found in there are actually the residents, if they belong there, because they could have just fled there because that was the building. So to my knowledge, there haven't been anyone who has been identified by name, but we know a lot of people escaped and wrote about what they saw and what they experienced. So for those people, you know, we have writings of who they were and what they saw. But in terms of the bodies themselves and the casts, to my knowledge, there hasn't been anyone that has been identified by name.
Let's see. So why is Pompeii more well known than Herculaneum, and is it studied more, promoted more?
So I think it's because the casts were made at Pompeii. So there haven't been the casts really made at Herculaneum or some of the other sites. There was at Atlantis in the 1980s an effort to create a cast using resin instead of plaster, and it didn't quite work out, and it looks like a person kind of in amber because it was like this weird brown shiny material. But I really think it's the city of Pompeii itself, mostly because of the people, right? The casts that were made, because I think those images really capture humanity. They capture people at their last moments. And I think that really evokes a lot of emotion. And then there was also a lot of movies filmed in and around Pompeii in the 50s and in the 60s. So that also kind of put the site on sort of people's radar in terms of popular culture.
Let me look here for our next question. Let's see. I was fascinated by the reimagining of the faces of people in the rotunda where the two bodies are on display. So your last slide there were some images on the wall. Is there a discussion available about how that was done, or do you think that may have been like an artistic rendering?
So I think the images that are sort of in the background are from some of the frescoes on the walls from the city. So I don't know that they're those individuals themselves. I'm not sure if any facial reconstruction has been done from any of the skeletal remains in Pompeii. To my knowledge, there hasn't been. I think because there's so many frescoes with people's faces already present. So we know what the ancient Pompeiians look like, but that's a really great question.
Yeah. Let me take a look here. You mentioned the 3D scans of casts that could be printed. We actually have a few in the exhibit. We printed several of them, and they're really interesting to be able to show people.
It's so cool because you can scale them up or scale them down. You can have, you know, a tiny plaster cast person or like a life-size one.
Yeah, even the loaf of bread that's in there, you know, because it's under glass, to be able to put that into a kid's hand for them to really feel it and see what it's like, it's very meaningful for them. Do you have any good advice on where you would find those 3D scans? If not, I might be able to help with this. There's someone who's asking about their students and how they would love to print those in their innovation lab at their school, which would be so cool.
So I am not sure if the superintendency has made them publicly available. So I don't think they're sort of out there open source. And what you would get is probably just the surface scan, so the outside shape of the object. But maybe, Jesse, you can mention how you all obtain scans and were able to print.
Yeah, well, we do what you're saying. So the outside scan, and it is, we use Thingiverse, and then we just put Pompeii into the search, and holy moly, there was a lot of stuff there. So awesome. It's very diverse, great experiences for a classroom. And I would encourage any classrooms who are watching to try that out and show us what you've made and show it off. That'd be great. So the next question here is any organic material preserved, like their last meals, their wood, furniture, things like that?
Yeah, there is actually a lot of organic material that's been found in buildings. I think there's kind of bread that's been found. I think there was cheese, some cheese that's been found. So because the ash sort of covered everything and kind of compacted, and this hot ash turned into almost concrete, tended to preserve a lot of the material sort of encased within it. In the context of human remains, humans go through normal processes of decomposition. There's sort of different stages of that. It's very kind of gross, but things like bread and food and cheese decompose in really different ways. And so I think the cheese from Pompeii is kind of more squished and compact than it would have been, but it's still cheese. And the cool thing about the cheese is that scientists were able to identify brucellosis bacteria in the cheese. And brucellosis comes from usually goat cheese or sheep cheese. And it's a disease that can affect the spine. So it's one of those diseases. We have evidence in the food, and then we have evidence in the human skeletal remains of that same bacteria. So it's kind of a cool connection there.
Yeah, that is fascinating.
Yeah.
We have a loaf of bread, just so everybody knows, from Pompeii in the exhibit. And what I think is really interesting is a lot of people will look at it and they'll consider it. And then when someone says to them, a human being made this 2,000 years ago, I see so many of our guests actually physically take their hands and they look at their own hands, right? And you can tell that they're picturing themselves as this person making this bread. And it really is just a wonderful thing to see over and over and over again in the exhibit. I would love to encourage everybody to come by and see the bread, because it's just fascinating to think about.
Well, and then just 2,000-year-old bread, like how cool is that?
2,000-year-old bread.
Cool.
It's cool. It's so crazy to think about. All right, let's see here. Okay, what will ultimately happen with the human skeletal remains? Will they ever be laid to rest or kept in scientific collections?
It's my understanding that they will be kept in collections. I don't think that there's any discussion of reburial. And this is a really important question, actually, because there's a lot of modern contention about skeletal collections and who are the stakeholders in terms of who these skeletal collections belong to, who do they represent? Do these individuals, did they give consent to be studied? And I think the Italian superintendency, the Italian archaeological groups have been very responsible in terms of how they choose to display human remains, and then how they choose to curate and store them for future study. So reburial is important for certain cultural groups. For other cultural groups, the ability to have these remains for future scientific study is really important. So 20 years from now, 100 years from now, we don't know what kind of technology will be available to go back and reanalyze some of these skeletal remains. So the question earlier about, well, in that big room of bone, could you put individuals back together again? Well, not with modern technology, but perhaps in the future we could do that if that was, if that was necessary, if that was something that a researcher wanted to do. But the Italians have built storerooms to store all of the ancient remains and also the newly found remains as well.
And to have modern bioarchaeologists and scientists and researchers who are thinking about the future means so much, right? They're thinking this needs to be preserved in a very responsible way, because in the future, we don't want people complaining about how thick or thin our plaster was and stuff like that, right?
And I think that's a really good point that goes back to the question about imaging subsurface, right? So many archaeological sites are never completely excavated. You save some of the site for future archaeologists that maybe have different technology, different methods, so that they might have different research questions as well. So it's very rare to have archaeological sites that are completely excavated.
Yeah. We're getting pretty close to our time here. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Okay.
Excuse me here, let's see. Which geophysical survey method proves to be the most effective in the field in terms of figuring out where exactly to excavate or where to pour the plaster as to not damage the remains?
So I'm not as familiar with which methods work best in volcanic soils, particularly in areas that are very close to volcanoes where there has been eruption and there's many different layers of pumice stone. I don't know if they've done sort of magnetometry or not, which is a subsurface method. I think they've done some GPR, but I'm not entirely sure. In terms of locating the voids, it's kind of been serendipitous, like where they're excavating and they hit some human remains, or they hit a void and then look inside and see human remains, and then know, all right, this is an area where we're going to find an individual or an animal, and then how they decide to proceed. These casts are very rare. So Fiorelli didn't make very many. The modern Italian archaeologists aren't making very many. I think they're proceeding as if we are going to excavate the skeletal remains and then analyze the skeletal remains rather than making more casts.
Wow. I think we might have one more question here. Let's see. Have casts helped us better understand Roman fashion or clothing in any way? And how common is it for those types of materials to have been found or in the cast?
So there are bits of wool that are still preserved that have formed part of the cast. I think in the image where I showed you with the master, his woolen cloak, he actually had still pieces of wool that were preserved. But it is mostly based on the shape of the clothing that they were wearing at the time of death. So when they were covered in the ash, and the ash sort of compacted to cover their bodies. So it covered the shape of their clothing. As in the picture of the little boy that I showed you, you could see he was wearing sort of like a shift or a tunic. So it tells us something about the weave of the fabric. If it was a fine weave, it probably meant it was a very fine cloth, or if it was more rough and woolen, it probably was lower quality. But we know what the Pompeiians wore also based on the frescoes that they painted, right? They painted themselves wearing all different kinds of clothing. And there's lots of historic writings about what people wore based on their station.
Yeah, well.
Or their social status, excuse me.
I just want to say thank you very much. This has been absolutely fascinating to listen to and participate in. Thank you again for taking the time and sharing with everybody. I want to let everybody know that our last Lunch in Pompeii session is going to be on January 14th. It'll be from 12 to 1 again. It'll be with Dr. Matthew Beaudelet. I hope that I pronounced that correctly. We're going to focus on forensic chemistry. Should be absolutely fascinating. And that's our last chance for a Lunch in Pompeii talk. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And then again, Dr. Wheeler, thank you very much. It's really fascinating. I cannot wait to share this information with our staff so that we can start sharing it in the exhibit. And I'm excited to see you next week. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.